to stop me and ask a question or make a comment. I'm happy. I want this presentation to really be as useful as it can be for all the different needs that are going to be in this room. I saw somebody mention they're about to write their F30. You know, maybe there's other people writing F30s, maybe there's people writing other kinds of grants. So if you have specific questions to you or just sort of questions in general about what I'm talking about, yeah, please feel free to stop me. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Oh, let's see. Oh, Krista. Hi, Krista. Hi, Crystal, both of you. Hi, Shannon. Oh, yeah, I'm seeing lots of familiar faces in here. It's great. Recently wrote an F31. Okay, yeah, great. Oh, and hey, Hannah. Oh, this is so exciting. Okay, great. I am going to share my slides here. And I'm also happy to share these slides afterward if anybody's interested. So if there's things that I'm moving past and you don't have time to write them down, I'll be happy to share the slides after as well. Okay, are you seeing what I want you to be seeing? I can't see anybody, so can someone give me a verbal?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
we can see in the screen.
Okay, great. All right, perfect. Well, thank you all so much for joining today. I'm really, really excited to be invited to present to Women in Science and PDX. It's such a cool organization. And this is a topic that I've been talking about a lot as a writing specialist. You can probably imagine that I get a lot of questions about AI right now. And of course, like how we can use it from the writer perspective, and then from the faculty perspective, it's always how can we stop them from using it. So today we're going to talk about just a lot of different aspects of it, some good, some bad, you know, the good, the bad, the ugly. And as I said, please feel free to ask questions. So I always like to start this presentation with this tweet or X, I'm not sure what we call them now, from this author. And she says, you know what the biggest problem with pushing all things AI is? Wrong direction. I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so that I can do art and writing, not for AI to do my art and writing so that I can do my laundry and dishes. And I include this here partly because I love it and partly because I think it really helps us get into the mindset as we're starting to think about what we want AI to be able to do for us. AI can do a lot of the cool and exciting parts of our jobs and our lives for us, but those may not be the things we want to give up or to get rid of. When I think about wanting AI to help me with my writing, I think about wanting it to clean up a draft at the end or help me format my citations, things that maybe I don't find as much pleasure in, I don't get to use my creativity for, things that are a bit nitpicky and kind of precise. But that might not be what everybody is looking for. So it's just an opportunity to sort of start to think about how you might want to use AI and how it can be helpful or what you might be losing in the process. So in the chat, I would just love to see on a scale of 1 to 5, what's your experience with using generative AI tools? 1 being never or you rarely use them, and 5 being you've used them, you know, many times or you use them often or daily. And I'm gonna actually see. There we go. Okay, great. Oh, we've got a range here. Amazingly, on a scale of 1 to 5, I don't see any 3s. I love this. Everybody has committed to one end of the scale or the other. Okay, great. So we're really running the gamut here in terms of how frequently people are using it, how familiar you are with using it. So the more familiar you are with it, some of what I'm going to talk about today might feel a little bit introductory. So if you have questions about any of it, please feel free to ask. But I am going to sort of go over some of the basics of what AI is, how it works, and then talk more specifically about how it interacts with the writing process. So the goal of our time here today is really information literacy. I'm not here to promote the use of AI and to say you should use it. I'm not here to say you shouldn't use it and to dissuade you away from it. I really just want people to have a good understanding of how it works, how you can use it, and then of course all of the limitations and drawbacks and concerns that go along with using a tool like this. It's definitely here. It's definitely here to stay. So it's important that we understand it and understand, how other people might be using it, how we ourselves could be using it. So again, I just like to sort of make that claim up front. So this is sort of just a very simplistic way of describing generative AI. So generative AI are computer systems that produce human-like expression in a variety of media. They can make text, images, videos, PowerPoint slides, etc. They can also create computer coding and other things like that. Large language models are a subset of this larger sort of field of generative AI, and they specifically produce text-based expressions such as prose, such as writing, even poetry, and programming code. So ChatGPT is an example of a large language model. And of course, there's so much more behind how these work, but this is just a broad overview of what these are. This prism is just, I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but it's just really a great image to sort of capture how many tools there really are out there within the generative AI field or realm. So you can see sort of on the inner white circle, it says video, sound, design, flows, conversational, and text. And then you can see different tools that relate to that. There's also lots of other kinds of categories that fall in this prism. But ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, some of these tools that have sort of like big brand names behind them. Those are the ones we hear a lot about. ChatGPT is almost like saying Kleenex, it's like kind of become a catch-all for a lot of these different tools, but you can really see how many tools are out there. And of course, they're changing all the time. There's new ones all the time. So this is probably outdated already, but it's really just to give you a sense of like the sheer number that are really out there that you can be using. So here's, again, a simplistic explanation of how large language models work. So in a large language model, such as ChatGPT, the user gives the large language model a prompt. So in the chat interface that you're using with ChatGPT, that's the question that you put in there. How do you blah, 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 or write me a poem about X? The large language model then mines a massive data set that it has of a whole bunch of different examples of language, and then it delivers an output that responds to your prompt. And we're going to talk about prompts in a minute. So I always like to stop at this point and sort of address the elephant in the room, which is, of course, our professional integrity, our personal integrity. When I'm talking to students, I'm talking about academic integrity. And really what we're mostly talking about when people are feeling concerned about, like, should I use it? Shouldn't I use it? Or when policies are saying don't use it, mostly what we're talking about is passing off AI generated text as your own. So that means no citation or no disclosure that you've used AI. What we're not really talking about is things like Microsoft Word tools, grammar check, spell check. There's a lot of like stylistic tools that Microsoft Word is doing, predictive text, citation generators, and then using tools like Grammarly and ChatGPT for grammar, style, and punctuation uses. So again, even though ChatGPT can create text that you could use, copy paste exactly as it is, you also can use it for some of these more like cleaning up processes. And a lot of policies aren't advising or requiring people not to use them for that, but rather for more of this kind of like wholesale use of the text. And we're really operating right now within an honor system because right now there's no AI detection software that has a high accuracy rate. And so it's really important for us to be thinking as we approach using AI, again, where our personal integrity interacts with the tool itself, where it interacts with the policies that might be constraining our use of the tool. But really, if we check a box on a grant application, for example, that says, no, I didn't use AI, there isn't a way necessarily for that organization to run your grant through a checker of some kind and come out with an accurate result of whether it was created by AI. And so it really is an honor system right now. We're based on our own personal ways that we're going to be using these tools and decisions about how we want to use them and all of those ethical considerations. So I'm going to shift into talking about prompts and how you can create more specific prompts so that you can create more specific output. So this is an example of a prompt that I gave to ChatGPT. And you'll see I've said, you're an easygoing professor in a rhetoric and composition program giving a graduate student feedback. Provide feedback to this graduate student on the scope of this paragraph's background information. And then I've copied and pasted in a paragraph that's from a paper I wrote in graduate school. And I point out that I wrote it because anytime you put in your information into a tool like ChatGPT or any generative AI tool, it then eats it and then owns it and can use it then in its future outputs. Again, it's going to be breaking it up into teensy tiny little pieces, but whatever information you're putting in there, that company, that tool now owns that information. So it is important that you're only putting things in there that either you own the copyright to or that is already available on the internet. So in this prompt, I've given the tool instructions about how to behave, so I can really give it some clear instructions about how I wanted to act. I wanted to act easygoing. I don't want it to give me too tough a feedback right now. I've given it a role. You're a professor in this particular kind of program, so some situation. And then I've given it an audience. You're writing this feedback for a graduate student. I've also specified the tasks that I want it to do and the instructions. This could be even more specific. I could say, give me a bulleted list, list the top 5 things this person should address. Write this in the style of XYZ person. Really, the sky's the limit for how you specify the tool to give you the output. And then this is the input that I've given it, which is the data I want it to analyze. So that could be an example of my writing. That could be some raw data that I wanted to analyze. And this is optional. So as you can see, here's another example of a prompt. Write 10 catchy opening lines for a scholarly article on using ChatGPT to support dissertation writing. And this is for an academic audience. So in this case, I've only given it context and audience, and I've only given it instructions. I haven't given it sort of additional tasks or any input for it to analyze. In this case, I'm relying on it to mine its data set so that it can come up with what it thinks are catchy opening lines for a scholarly article. And essentially with prompts, the more specific your prompt can be, the more accurate your output can be. And that seems pretty obvious. I was talking to somebody the other day who works in large language model research, and the way that he was explaining it to me just really kind of like lit it up helped me understand it better, even though it does seem really obvious on the front. The way these tools work, of course, is using sort of statistical analysis to, predict what words go together, what order these words will go in. And so the more words and the more detail that you give it, the more likely it is to look in places and to pull information from places that match what you're trying to get at. So that's just to say that the more information you can give it at the forefront, the better it's going to be in the output. You can also refine any responses that you get, just as when you're chatting with somebody, chatting with customer service or whatever online, you can say, oh, okay, great, thanks for that response, but actually, can you now do that again, but with this additional information? So that's called refinement when we're working with these large language model prompts. So I'm going to shift into talking about some different ways you could use AI in your writing process. So whether you're working on a manuscript or a grant, and these are for the early stages of your writing process. And then we'll talk about some of the later stages. So a lot of people have found tools like ChatGPT to be really useful for refining research questions, so early in the research process, and also for helping with scope. So if you're thinking about, literature scope for a literature review, you can be helping it or it can help you determine whether or not, you can go broader. And if you were to go broader, what would you be including? Can you go narrower? What would you be cutting out? What might you focus on? Identifying connections among texts. There are a couple tools that do this in a really cool way, Research Rabbit and Aria, which Aria is a Zotero plugin and Research Rabbit is just its own. claims or thesis statements or central arguments, sometimes people just have a hard time figuring out how to phrase exactly what they're going to say. So it isn't that they need help with the content so much as just the actual creation of the language, the creation of the sentences. Creating an outline from a zero draft. For some people, it's easier to get started writing if they just sort of word vomit or brain dump or some other kind of vaguely gross analogy, and then take that free write, all of that kind of train of thought in your head and put that into a tool like ChatGPT, and it can give you an outline of what you've written, highlight some key points. Figuring out body paragraph structure, particularly if you're working within a genre that is very formulaic and that is very constrained, like a specific aims page, for example, and you're really saying, okay, this body paragraph needs to cover this, this, and this. The second one needs to have this, this, and this, and these things need to relate in this way. That it can really help with things like that. Topic sentence options, similar to the claims or the thesis statements. Summaries of sources, so putting in, either uploading documents of publicly available articles and having it give you a summary, or copying and pasting from online and giving it a summary, and then it can give you a summary of that source. Again, this can be useful, especially for your reading process, your research process, but I wouldn't use any of that text wholesale. Again, because it's not your text, but also because there are probably likely inaccuracies in there. So you always would want to triangulate that before you said, these authors claim XYZ, and then actually that's not quite in line with what the actual publication says. And then, of course, they can generate initial drafts. I mean, ChatGPT can do all the writing for you. The higher you get in your career, in your academic journey, the less likely it's going to be to create, at least at this point in time, to create the level of thinking and the level of connection and synthesis that you are capable of. But the tool will improve over time. It will be able to do that. But again, that probably isn't the most ethical way to use it. And you're probably also you're going to miss out on a lot of that process of what that means to think through a problem like this, to put that problem into words. So I personally stay away from doing that, but it is something that is possible. And it's important to note that any of these could be disallowed. Any of these uses could be disallowed based on the policies that you're being asked to adhere to, either by a grant organization, a publication, or something else. And any of these might require some kind of attribution. And we're going to talk about attribution a little bit later. So some ideas for later stages of the writing process to use generative AI tools are to receive feedback on a draft. And I'm going to show you an example of that in just a minute. Evaluate your writing for audience appropriateness. There are other tools that do this as well. Evaluate for this should be a grade 8 level, or this should be, grade 12 level reading. But ChatGPT and other tools like it can do that as well. And that can be really useful. I know that, for some grants, you're asked to write a scientist summary and a non-scientist summary, or for some grants, you might have, the panel might include, patient representatives or other non-scientist members. And so it can be important for you to be able to figure out, where am I using too much jargon? Where should I be defining more things? Where should I be providing more background information and all of that? Summarizing your own writing in order to create an abstract. So here's my article, or here's my draft, and I need you to create an abstract out of that. Identifying keywords or search terms. Data analysis and visualization. This isn't necessarily something ChatGPT would do, though it can. The visualization part, of course, is more of one of those visual creating tools. But I just think it's important to mention here because, of course, this is often a huge part of our writing processes. Reviewing data for errors and bias. It can theoretically do this, but it's also itself, these tools themselves are riddled with errors and bias. And so, I don't know if it's the best tool to help you do that, but it can. Translation, again, something else to take with a grain of salt. If you're translating an article to read for yourself, that might be an appropriate use. If you're translating an article then to, either provide that translation somewhere else or to sort of do this wholesale, that might be someplace where you'd want to get some additional input, for example, from somebody who speaks that language. And then putting in your own papers or your own documents and having the tool create bullet points for a lecture or a presentation. There's also tools that can create entire slide decks for you. ChatGPT and other large language model tools don't do that, but they can be really helpful in sort of distilling like the main points of what it is that you're talking about. So if you've got a paper or your dissertation or a grant, and then you have to give an oral presentation version of that, can be really useful. And then again, any of these could be disallowed by any policies, and any of them might require some kind of attribution. So it's a good time to talk about limitations. We've already talked about a few, but I'm just going to sort of list some here and that we haven't necessarily touched on. So large language models are purposely opaque about where the information is coming from. So we aren't able to trace from ChatGPT's output. We're not able to trace backwards to where it got this information or where it learned how to do this particular thing or learned about this particular topic. So and these tools, the companies that make them, are purposely opaque about that. So it's not like, oh, well, it's just really hard to know. I'm sure it is hard to know, but also they don't divulge that. So we don't sort of have a sense of what these databases look like or what's informing them. These tools, of course, are very undiscerning. So as you know, the internet is full of a lot of beautiful, wonderful things, and it's full of a lot of absolute garbage. And ChatGPT doesn't have really any way of telling the difference between those things. And so it can give you something from somebody's personal blog from 2005, or it could give you something from a published scholarly article. Its output is highly biased in favor of dominant cultures. So the global dominant culture. So white, male, mostly Western or American, capitalistic. So any output, because that is a lot of what is already on the internet, or dominantly what's on the internet, especially things that are paid for, that ends up being a lot, biasing a lot and coloring a lot of its output. It's known, large language models and AI in general is known for hallucinating facts or sources, and these are actually called AI hallucinations. There's always a risk of accidental plagiarism. So of course, especially if you're asking ChatGPT to, give you any kind of discussion about concepts or ideas, you don't necessarily know where those ideas or concepts came from. The accidental plagiarism is less about, I copied and pasted text from ChatGPT and that might be accidental plagiarism. This is more like conceptually, because again, ChatGPT and other tools like it, they aren't thinking for themselves. They're only putting together bits and pieces of information and reproducing them for you. There's also knowledge cutoffs for all of these tools, and it's a little bit hard sometimes to figure out what they are. The most recent dates that I could find were for ChatGPT 4, that's December 2023, and actually for their newer tool 4.0, that's May 2023. So that means like if you were to put something in here about a celebrity who's passed away after those dates, then it wouldn't know. So that's kind of a test that some people do to try to figure out. And then the closer that you get to those dates with a particular event, these are soft cutoff dates. So the closer you get to these dates, the less likely it is that they're going to be sure about any particular thing that like happened at a specific point in time. I'd say there's some debate about whether it's time saving, because if you're really using it in a the issue, but certainly anxiety saving, just taking that stress off of your mind saving, some of that can just be really useful, especially when we have fear of the blank page, we haven't gotten started on something, we've been procrastinating, and this can kind of help us get a little bit of like a jumping off point. As a writing teacher, I have to say, that you risk losing the benefits of the writing process. Writing is not just about creating a product, it's really about thinking through a topic, something that we're grappling with, questions that we have, and putting those thoughts and building an argument, putting those all into words. And so, of course, the more that we rely on tools like this, the more we lose the benefits of that, the development of our own critical thinking, the development of our own thinking abilities to make connections in this way. There are lots of security, privacy, and personal data concerns. So as I mentioned earlier, like when I was using the paragraph from the paper that I wrote in graduate school, I'm okay putting that in there. It's not been published. I don't plan to publish it. But you might be working with, especially as scientists, you might be working with some very new data, some very proprietary data. Maybe you're working with data that isn't solely yours. It belongs to a lab that you work in. And so it's really important to be thinking about what information you're putting into these tools, because again, I know there are certain ways that you can use the tools like offline, and you can use them in ways that are safer, but it is important to be really conscientious about what information you're giving to these tools and whether or not you want that to be sort of chewed up by the tool and then be able to be spit out somewhere else. There are lots of labor and environment concerns. So the labor concerns are around, of course, all the like management and creation of the servers and all of the technology that supports these kinds of tools. And then the amount of energy that is required to use these kinds of tools, especially for things like image generation, is just a huge, huge amount of energy output. So that's a real environmental concern as well. And then these tools are very biased against non-standard English and writers for whom English is not a first language. So this comes into play a lot when people start to want to use AI tools to determine whether somebody has used AI or not. If a writer, if English isn't a writer's first language and that draft is put into ChatGPT, it's much more likely to say, yes, AI was used to write this, than if somebody for whom English is their first language and has, a strong grasp of standardized English, if their draft is put into a tool like that, it's less likely to say that their writing was done by an AI tool. So this is really, really problematic, especially in a field like science, where, of course, people of all linguistic backgrounds are participating, and English is a global language. So it is not a language that is owned or solely spoken by people for whom it's their first language. So this is a really, really big deal, especially for any of these kinds of, credibility checkers or any of these things. Okay, so here is a prompt that I gave to ChatGPT to receive feedback on a draft. I told it, I'm hoping to revise this paper from graduate school into an article I'll submit. Please provide feedback on the development of my argument. I gave it a role as a journal editor. I gave it more context for the specific journal that I was hoping to publish it in. Here's a link to their submission guidelines, and it was able to pull from the submission guidelines at the URL that I gave it, and then I copied and pasted a whole article in here. It did pretty well when I did this. I would say, again, the more specific you can be with it about the feedback that you want. I'm looking for feedback on reading level. I'm looking for whether or not I use too much jargon. I'm looking for feedback on the coherence and the flow of my writing, particularly as it pertains to the development of my argument around this topic. So I would say probably it's less useful for putting an entire draft into, and more useful to do piecemeal. Here's my introduction. Am I sort of setting the stage well? Is it clear, how the background information leads to my central argument? Here's my literature review, sort of, getting feedback on smaller pieces of your writing rather than sort of wholesale. But it does come up with a lot of feedback. You can also ask it more for specific feedback about grammar or more like big picture issues like organization. I also asked it to make a presentation outline for me based on the same paper. So I said, create an outline for this 30-minute presentation. And then again, I gave it some who the audience will be, what the context is for a job talk, et cetera, et cetera. And what I found really funny about this was it gave me an extremely detailed outline, like way more detailed than I would have ever made for creating my own presentation, which was really useful. But the numbers, it had, 5 minutes for this, 3 minutes for this, et cetera. and the numbers added up to 38 minutes. So even as something as easy as being able to add up to 30, that wasn't even something I thought like, oh, maybe it won't be able to get this right. But it's just to really say that like everything that you put in there, take with a grain of salt, or I should say everything that it gives back to you, take with a grain of salt, because it really just is not perfect. And the tools will improve as we move along in time. But right now, and I don't know if that's good or bad, but right now they're just not at a place where you want to be sort of accepting what they give you as any kind of truth. So in the chat, I'd love to hear, again, just on a scale of 1 to 5, how likely are you to try using or to continue using generative AI for your writing? And again, I've got no stake in this game. I'm just really curious because I know that sometimes after we talk about these things, people are feeling really like, no way, this is not for me. I don't like, this is, weird. I don't like this. And some people are like, this sounds great. Like the less I can do with some of these, harder parts of the writing process, the better. Okay, yeah. So we're more at the 4 to 5 end of the range, but we've got some 2s, a 1, only for work. Yeah. Yeah, great. Thank you. Let me get back here. Okay, so the last part, last topic I'm going to talk about is the idea of attribution and how do we attribute generative AI. So some different citation styles are approaching generative AI and citing generative AI in different ways. And I point this out only because I think it's really interesting. There's no consensus, of course. I mean, there's not going to be any consensus. And so different citation styles, different organizations, different publishers, as we'll look at in a minute, they're all trying to grapple with how do we manage this thing? How do we do it in line with our own values, our own style, for our own fields that we represent and things like that. So AMA has a citation format for ChatGPT. And as you'll see, they put the tool itself, ChatGPT, sort of in what I would call the author position, or like the first thing you see when you see the citation. And then they've got the company that creates the tool, OpenAI, more in like a publisher kind of position. And then in APA, we've got it kind of reversed. OpenAI, the company that creates the tool, is in more of the author position. And then the tool itself is more in like the publication position, or, title of an article position. So just a little bit interesting. So like in an in-text citation, you would be in AMA, you would see ChatGPT. And then in APA, you would see OpenAI in the in-text citation. So just kind of interesting to look at. And again, I acknowledge I'm a writing teacher and find these things interesting. Maybe you're like, no. And then Chicago Manual of Style has 2 different ways. Either, similar to AMA, where it's specifying this is text generated by ChatGPT, but then also putting in, including the prompt somewhere in there as well. And again, most of us will be using prompts that are much longer than explain how to make pizza dough from common household ingredients. But it's just interesting that Chicago Manual of Style is trying to figure out how it can integrate the prompt into its citation recommendations, so that that is part of what the reader is getting as they're learning, okay, ChatGPT has been used to create this text. But it is important to note that ChatGPT and other large language models like it are non-deterministic. So if I were to put that prompt in about pizza dough, I would get a different response than if you were to put it in right now, or if someone else were to put it in tomorrow. So that's kind of helpful, but also not entirely helpful, which brings me to my next point, which is this idea of, should we be citing AI or should we be disclosing AI? Some of you might know Stephen Bedrick, Dr. Stephen Bedrick, who works at OHSU. He works in large language model research. Knows so much about it. It's so interesting to listen to him talk about it. And he gave me, so some of this slide is from him, and he really got me thinking about this. So In citation, the reason we cite is that citation discloses when something isn't the author's original idea. It gives credit to whoever's idea it actually was. It allows the reader to follow a scholarly thread or some kind of thread of, where this information or these ideas are coming from. And then it situates our own ideas as a writer in a larger conversation. So when you're writing a literature review in a grant or in any other kind of document, this is exactly what you're doing. You're including all these citations, not only to say when someone's thoughts aren't your own, but to do this work of situating your own ideas within this larger conversation. When you're talking about addressing the gap and, identifying what the gap is that your research is aiming to fill, you're situating your ideas, your work within a larger conversation. Okay, here's this larger conversation, and here's what hasn't been discussed yet. But a tool like ChatGPT or a large language model can really only do this first one. It can only disclose when something is, or I should say, when we cite ChatGPT, we can only disclose when something isn't our own original idea. We can't give credit to whoever's idea it actually was, because there's no way for us to identify that or trace that through the tool. And therefore, we can't allow the reader to follow a scholarly thread because there really isn't one there. There's nothing to start the thread. And we can't really situate our own ideas within a larger conversation. The only conversation that's happening is between us and the chatbot, and that chatbot doesn't have its own ideas. So this is really, it's sort of like, I don't know, opening a door and then there's like nothing on the other side of the door. It just drops off, into the yard. There's no stairs there or anything. So this is just an interesting thing because we're trying to, these different styles are trying to grapple with how you might cite it. And yet maybe more fundamentally, citation isn't the route to go. So as Stephen argues, and as I've been thinking about, disclosure is really more appropriate for when we're using tools like ChatGPT. So disclosure is used when generative AI supported the writing process, but there's no direct quoting or paraphrasing from generative AI. So if you were to direct quote or paraphrase, then yeah, you would want to cite ChatGPT again, even though it's a little bit murky and doesn't quite fit, but that's kind of the best system we've got. Disclosure describes AI's role in the creation of the text. So rather than needing to cite a specific place, it more describes how AI was used. You might provide prompts or even complete chat logs sometimes. And then this can occur in the methods section, it could occur in the acknowledgement section, or it could occur in an appendix section. And we're going to look at some policies in a minute that specify different places where that might occur. If you were to put it in the methods section, that would of course be if you were using some sort of AI tool in your research process. The acknowledgements and the appendices part would be more if you were using it in the writing process of what you're creating. So to move on to publishers, and when I talk about publishers, I'm talking about manuscripts, but we're also going to look at like NIH and NSF and some of the policies that also oversee their grants as well. So some different ways that publishers are using AI, they are not, at least according to them, using it as the sole decision maker. There's been a myth about automatic rejections, manuscripts getting run through an AI tool and getting rejected or accepted to, proceed farther along down the path. Publishers say they're not using it in this way. They do use it, however, to determine suitability scores for selecting a journal. So if the journal or the organization oversees multiple journals, they'll look for a suitability score. To create copy editing scores, so how much labor will it take to bring this particular manuscript up to whatever their standards are. For identifying plagiarism or paper mills, again, this isn't like identifying when AI has generated the text, but more something like Turnitin, which you're probably familiar with from school, and identifying other kinds of similar patterns across papers that might identify that it wasn't always written by a person, or that it's being written by a place that's just sort of paying people to generate them. Looking for conflicts of interest. Assigning appropriate reviewers, so using a tool to connect drafts with reviewers, cross-checking resubmissions for, integrating feedback, how they've improved the draft. And it's also important to know that they might sell your rights to use your research in large language models. So this happened recently with a sale with Taylor and Francis publishers. So You might, by publishing with a particular organization, they might be looking for the ability to be able to sell your manuscript wholesale to like one of these tools like OpenAI, or one of these companies like OpenAI, so that they can use it in their databases for their large language models and to train their large language models. So something to be aware of. As far as I know, I haven't seen any grant entities doing that. I haven't heard about that at all. I think that would be very antithetical to the mission of things like NIH, NSF, because obviously they want proprietary research, but just something to sort of be aware of that might start to happen more. So as we start to look at some publisher Gen AI policies, you'll notice that all of them here, and I've got NIH and NSF highlighted in orange here, you'll notice that all of them do allow AI generated text as long as there's documentation. And by documentation, I mean like what we were talking about with disclosure. Some of them specify where that disclosure could happen, as you could see, methods, results, acknowledgements, discussion, cover letter, and some of them don't specify. So it's always a good idea, if you are using any tool like that, to save the chat logs that you have as you're using it, just for your own records, just in the event that you do need to give more specifics about disclosure. But a lot of these like cover letters or the initial you know, sort of forms that you're filling out as you're submitting something are starting to ask about whether you've used generative AI. And all of these policies really specify that regardless of whether you've used it or not, regardless of whether you've disclosed it, that the author is responsible for whatever words are in their own writing. So the idea of accidental plagiarism is sort of what they're getting at here. And in general, this excludes spell check, grammar check, predictive text, things like that. And then you can see that none of them allow reviewers to use large language models or ChatGPT tools during the peer review process, except for maybe improving their own report. But they are not allowed to put your manuscript into a tool and then have it spit out feedback that they can just, you know, copy paste or revise into their own report. So again, that's because of copyright issues, proprietary research, all of these different things. So you can be, you know, again, it would have to, this has to be happening within like a realm of honor system. We can't know for sure if people are doing that, but it is disallowed. NSF does say it allows approved AI tools for reviewers, but it doesn't specify what those tools are. I haven't been able to figure that out. So I'm imagining that those are some sort of internal tools that they, you know, give reviewers access to, but I'm not positive. And then you can see there's a little bit of non-consensus about whether AI generated images are allowed to be used. I couldn't find information for some, but I could for others. And then none of them grant authorship to generative AI. So again, it has to be something that's disclosed, you know, occurs in the acknowledgements or something like that. And yeah, as I said, that's primarily for confidentiality concerns. So that's what I have for today. I really, really appreciate all of you listening. I've got some time for questions. If you've got any questions, I'm going to stop sharing here.
So thank you everyone for tuning in. And so now we're going to move on to the confidential Q&A session. So feel free, the recording has now stopped, and feel free to raise your hand.